And then, there we go. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to open it up so people can jump in and I don't have to there's no waiting room then. So,
excellent.
Woohoo! Perfect.
All right.
So yeah.
So
we'll give them like one more minute and then just start.
awesome. Excellent. Yeah.
And I'll mute so I don't interrupt. Once you get started, I'll mute. So
Perfect. Okay.
yeah, fantastic. So you just got to Utah. So how long you've only been there? Like a week or two?
It's been about 2 weeks now.
Wow.
Yeah. So I drove over from DC, but I made some stops on the way, picked up a few things here and there. And then as soon as I got to town, I basically hit the ground running. I actually had to redo the floor in my studio space here and just like completely set up shop.
Oh my gosh.
So now I'm really like ready to roll in here. The space is set up. I have benches all around this room, which you can't see the rest of the room, but it's very set up. I have my
nice.
all the equipment ready to go.
Oh, that looks amazing.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Wow, nice setup.
Oh, thank you.
Right. Oh, we have an audience.
Hey.
Hey, Rob.
Hey, guys.
So what I was telling your brother was that we're recording it, and while it might not many people may show up, people have been watching this stuff at night. So yeah, we'll post it just like we've been doing. So Rob, I think it's all you now. Go ahead.
All right. So for those who don't know me, my name is Rob Wood. I'm a violin maker, currently employed by a shop in Washington, D.C. called Potter Violins. But I am working out of a space in Utah called Sugar House Violins. It's a new shop in town, and I have my own studio space here to meet with my clients and basically make instruments full time. So my background is as a violin maker, as well as a violin repair person, you could say a restorer. And I specialize really in upkeep, as well as adjustment of instruments. And that's everything from student level up to the very high end, including historic pieces made by the classical Italian masters. And that's what I've really been focusing on over the last 3 years, especially, is the optimization of those instruments played by professional musicians. But today I kind of wanted to start off and talk to you about the making process, some of the tools that I use, the forms, so that you can understand how these instruments are constructed. And then afterwards, we can talk a little bit about how to maintain them. And hopefully this process, showing you this process, will give you a little more insight into why it's so important to take care of these instruments, and and exactly how to do it properly, okay? And so, yeah, to start off, on this end of the table, I've got some pieces of wood here. This down low that you can see, this is a block of spruce. And if you look here, I don't know how good the camera resolution is, but you should be able to see like some rings. So this sits in the tree, like a round tree. If we cut the tree down, we can split it into these little segments. And essentially this will become the top of your instrument. This is what we use to make the top of your instrument. This is spruce. And then the back of your instrument will be made out of typically maple. And I didn't have a large maple log to drag in, but these are pieces that are cut out of that log. So if you can imagine each one of these wedges working around into a circle, that's the tree. The tree would be like this, okay? And then we'll cut out these wedges, which are called billets, and then we'll split those as well like that. So then these will be matched like this. And that's called book matching, when you cut it out like that and put them sideways. And then these will be joined together, and then a back can be carved out of that. So that's the maple. So those are the two primary woods that we use to make violins. There are some other ones that we'll use for different components, but that's the basics. This here is called a mold or a form. And historically, like in the time of Stradivari and other classical makers, they made them out of walnut like this. And this is what will essentially build the instrument around. There are other molds out there that are called outside molds. And basically the instrument is built inside of this perimeter instead. But this is what I use and what a lot of makers use. So this is an inside mold. So we'll derive this based on an outline that we want to achieve. So the outline of the instrument, we'll take that and then basically create a form that will give us that result. This is kind of the next step. We'll take some blocks of either willow or spruce and glue them onto the mold in these spots. This will give us support for the top and back of the instrument, as well as the neck, which will get set into this block here. So that's important to know that your instrument does have little blocks in there. After that, we'll take part of that maple that we use to make the back. Sometimes you'll have a separate piece and you'll cut out these strips of wood. Okay, and they don't start out this thin. So we'll cut out strips of wood and then we use lots of different tools to shape this down and make it very thin. And it can be down to like 1 millimeter thick. So that's also important to know that the outsides of your instrument, those side pieces, they're usually only about 1 millimeter thick, a little bit more for viola and then a little bit more for cello and bass. Okay. So those ribs will be scraped down to about 1 millimeter thick, and then we'll heat up what's called a bending iron, which looks like this, something like this. They have lots of different shapes and sizes, but you see there, and we'll heat this up very, very hot. In fact, it'll get so hot that when you put a bead of water on top, it'll actually bead off of the top of the iron instead of sizzling away. Okay, that point is called Leidenfrost point. It's very, very hot. And so we get our irons right up to that temperature, and then it'll allow us to bend this really hard maple all the way around to the shapes that we need. Okay, and essentially we're going for something like this. So this is the outsides of the violin, the ribs, and these have all been bent into place. These corner blocks have been nicely shaped to accommodate the ribs there, and then these are joined. Okay, so that's called a rib structure, and that's it. And so there's little strips here, if you can see, around the outside here, all the way around, and some of them are cut into those blocks. Those are called linings, and those can be made out of spruce or willow. And they help give us a little more gluing surface when we glue the top and the back onto the instrument. Okay, it also gives it a little more rigidity and helps it prevent it from like bending over time. Okay, so this is what a rib structure looks like when it's taken off of the mold, because eventually that mold is just there to hold its shape and give us the initial shape, but we do remove it and shape these blocks down. So this is actually pretty much what your violin looks like finished on the inside, with just the rib structure there, and those blocks. You can see how they match that contour, and then here and at the top. That's it. And this is very flexible, right? So that's the rib structure. This is the top. So this is the top in the process, and you can see we kind of get a general thickness around the sides. We establish a kind of a height in the middle, and then we start working the wood away. So some people think that these are bent into shape, but they're not. They're actually carved into shape. There are some makers over time who have bent plates into shape. Those do exist, but this is kind of the general rule here, is to carve it away. So you'll carve that arch shape out, okay? And then, of course, this is still full of wood, so this has to be hollowed out to get it to its final thicknesses. So that's a top plate. And this one is a back. So you can kind of just see like different steps of the process here. Okay. So there is a joint in the middle of this one. You do have, some people will probably ask about one-piece backs. So a one-piece back, the only difference is that it's not joined in the middle. And a reason to use that is because you have a piece of wood that's big enough or you find it more beautiful. However, this is the standard, is to have two pieces for the back. It makes it quite a strong joint. Yeah, and it's actually harder to do. Okay, so that's the back. And then here I have a finished plate that has a bass bar in it. So this is the inside of, when your violin is finished, this is what the top looks like, okay? It's very thin. It's usually down somewhere between 2 and 3 millimeters thick. So not very much real estate there. 2 to 3 millimeters thick all the way around. And then this little guy here is called a bass bar. And it's glued in there. It's not carved out. It's a separate piece of wood that's been glued in. And it helps to give some stiffness to the top and transmit sound across the plate. It really does protect the instrument too from sinking down over time. And these get replaced over time. Okay, it could be 50 years or more, but they do get replaced. These things you see here, this is on an older violin, but these are cleats. So these are repair cleats. There's been a crack in this instrument before. So when we go in to fix an instrument, you may find things like that. Little pieces of wood that have been glued on to hold a crack closed, or patches that have been inlaid to help support a broken area. And obviously we have to cut the F-holes out too. So that frees up, it's funny because the F-holes, these sound holes here, they free up the plate and allow it to move and flex in different ways. And then the bass bar stiffens it again. Okay, so that's the top plate. It's very thin. And then this is the inside of one with the back on. Okay, like so. And the neck is inlaid into that block. So you can see it's set in there. And those should be fit really well not to come out. This is actually a new system. The way that you see this one done is how all modern instruments are pretty much done. The neck is cut into this block, but back when Stradivari was making and those old master makers, they didn't do that. They had a Baroque setup, which had entirely different tension on the instrument. The strings were made of gut. They just pulled on the instrument much different. Our modern strings have metal, they have synthetic cores. There's a lot of tension. We've really changed the angle of these necks to be much higher. Back in the old days, these necks were much lower, like this. And they were just butted right up against the back of the instrument and nailed into place. It's not a super effective system, which is why it was modernized and updated. And so most of those old instruments that you see, even Strads that people perform with on stage, have had new necks installed. However, they'll cut the scroll out and save the original scroll. So they'll cut it here in the peg box and then inlay new maple and then set a new neck. Okay, and that allows us to accomplish the sounds that we need from a modern instrument today. Okay, but there's a lot of tension. I guess what I'm trying to emphasize is on a modern instrument, there's a lot of tension pulling across this thing. Our strings are pulling really hard, even more so than violins that were made 300 years ago were designed to. All right, and then this is a new violin, a modern violin. This is made by one of my good friends. And you can see that it's very different in terms of its design. However, it performs very much like a standard violin. And I wanted to show this idea, this concept, because we tend to get very set in our ideas about how a violin should look to operate well, or like we get really hung up on design features of violins and how they should be. And really, the violin has been adapting over centuries. We've had it since 1600s, what we know as the violin today. And that concept has over time has been optimized and changed, like that neck angle we were talking about that's been modernized, string technology. And so there's no reason that people shouldn't be able to make a new design that still functions properly. This one in particular is really cool. And I can show you, we looked at it for a second there, but this rig over here, this is called an impact rig. And so now that we're getting kind of into a new I would say that today is like a new age of violin making. We have all science, we have all the science that we could possibly want to study these instruments, figure out what makes them tick, what makes them work, and we can troubleshoot certain tonal issues with things like this. So this impact rig is designed to tap the instrument, and it can tap different parts and then give us frequencies through a computer. We can look at these sound waves and figure out how exactly it's operating. So this helps us look at design and acoustics of instruments. Just to kind of give you an example of stuff that we can do now that helps us out. So this is one other thing I wanted to show you in terms of like modern innovation and how, you know, we're making violins today. This plate has actually been cut out with a special machine, a CNC machine, which is basically just like a fancy drill hooked up to a computer, and it goes around and it can carve the shape for us if we have a computer program that'll allow us to do it. And that's kind of neat, right? So this is based on this is based on the Chrysler Del Jesu, which is an old violin some people know, made in the 1700s. And this just basically recreated the entire arch to a fairly high degree of accuracy, just with a machine. Okay. So yeah, that was basically the overview I wanted to do, just to kind of show the parts of a violin. Depending on who you ask, some makers will say that there's 56 parts to a violin. Some break it down even further and say there's more like 70 something. Anyway, the important thing to know is there are a lot of components that make your instrument, different types of wood, and different thicknesses going on there, as well as adding tension to the whole system by putting on like really high-tech strings and really steep angles. Some other components that are important to point out are the bridge that holds up the strings, okay? Looks like this. Before it's cut, this is like a general blank that we use sometimes. So we'll get a general shape cut out on a saw, and then we'll shape them down to a better finished shape. You know, but these are not very thick. So your bridge here is only, you know, it's around 4 to 5 millimeters thick. And that's maple. And at the top, it's only about 1.3 millimeters thick here at this crest. So where all those strings are coming over, there's an incredible amount of tension, and it's only being held up by, you know, 1.5 millimeters. And the last thing that I wanted to show was a sound post. So this goes inside of a violin or a viola or a cello. Sits right about here. And you might be able to see it. I don't know. Can you see that stick in there? Yeah. So there's a sound post in there, and it's not held with glue. It's not held up with glue or any sort of sticky adhesive at all. It's just held in by friction. So the top and the bottom are perfectly shaped, should be perfectly shaped to mimic the surface of the top and the back. It's held in there with tension, and it's moved around with a very special tool that we have called a sound post setter. Looks like this. Sound post setter is kind of like a luthier's or violin maker's wand. Everyone looks a little bit different and is shaped specifically for that maker. And it's what we use to get in here and move that post around and set it in the proper location. This also plays a huge role when we're adjusting an instrument to sound good or sound better. It's also important where we put it and how we put it in there, because it can help keep an instrument safe depending on how much tension we put there and exactly where we place it. Okay, so that's an important thing to know is inside your violin. If your strings happen to come loose and say your bridge falls over, your sound post could also fall over without you knowing. So if you hear something rattling around in there, it's probably your sound post, and you really don't want to tighten your strings up again without getting that properly set back in place by a professional, by a luthier. Yeah. So that covers most of the stuff that I wanted to hit just in the components of the instrument. I do have some tools and things, but really I wanted to get into some talk about maintenance, adjusting, and then whatever questions you guys might have about, say, purchasing an instrument or trading and things like that. Yeah. All right. Okay, so first off, with our instruments, they're made of wood, and now we've seen that they're made out of quite thin wood. In fact, the back I didn't even mention gets thinner than the top in a lot of cases. So we have really thin wood that we're working with, and wood is highly affected by both temperature and humidity. Okay, those are two big factors when we're considering taking care of our instruments. So you want to keep your instrument stored somewhere between 60 and 70 degrees Fahrenheit. That's optimal, right? So within that range, your instrument's nice and happy, and you want to pay close attention to that. So if you have a thermometer in the room where you're playing or where you're storing your instrument, that can be really helpful. Try and keep it between 60, 70 degrees. For humidity, they make these special little gadgets called a hygrometer. Okay, and a hygrometer, they make digital hygrometers that you can Velcro to a wall, or you can even Velcro inside of your case. I don't have one here with me, unfortunately. It's packed away, but there are lots and lots of different models of these. You can search them online. They're very readily accessible these days. So I would suggest that everyone have a hygrometer, a digital hygrometer that you can put inside of your case. It'll tell you what the humidity is, the relative humidity is inside that case. And then I recommend having one in your room as well, wherever you're playing most or storing your instrument. And the reason that's important is because these instruments, the wood that they're made out of has been aged, usually for a very long time. And that allows the instrument or the wood to dry to a degree. However, if it dries more rapidly after it's made, it can crack, okay? So the wood will shrink and expand still. And if it gets too dry, simply it'll crack. And those cracks can form along the edges, they can form in the middle, all over the place. And so we really want to take care of it by controlling that humidity. We want to keep the humidity somewhere between 45 and 55%. And that's relative humidity, meaning that's a percentage of how much humidity, how much moisture the air can hold. So 45% to 55% is really ideal for most of our instruments. And that being said, you can humidify an entire room, which is great. That's super helpful if you have that ability, like you're able to buy humidifiers or dehumidifiers depending on where you live. But most of the time, I recommend keeping your instrument stored in its case. So once you're done playing, you can put your instrument back in its case, close it up, zip it up, and then you can use a damp it, which is like the little worm, the little green worm that you fill with water and put through the F-hole and let it sit there. You have to fill that each day. Or you can use packets. They have humidification packets, and there are lots of different companies that make these packets. I personally use a brand called Bovida, B-O-V-I-D-A. They make humidification packets for like humidors for cigars, things like that. However, when you're purchasing those, you want to be really careful to get one that regulates the humidity to around 49 or 50%. You can search online and find those Bovida packets. I think it's B-O-V-E-D-A actually, but I think you can find those packets up to 70%, which would be not great for your instrument. Okay, so you might find those packets cheaper, but if you're not careful, you may get the wrong ones. So around 50%, and those packets are nice. They go into a little soft perforated sleeve. They can sit in your case, like usually up near the scroll somewhere. Usually there's an area where you can set that where it's not pressing against the instrument. Okay, so that kind of leads me on to my next point of cases. If you get a really nice instrument and you get a really junky case, I don't feel like it's doing the best service to your instrument. Your instrument can get broken in a case that's able to twist or smash down, doesn't have a great seal around the edge, or doesn't keep the instrument suspended. And I'll show you exactly what I mean by that, okay? So I'll show you one case that helps me demonstrate this. If I can, okay. So this is a small case. Mostly this case is used by violin makers because it doesn't have a spot for a bow, but it helps me demonstrate my purpose, okay? So it's by a company called BAM. Most of you may have heard of them, and there are lots of good case companies out there. But if you can see inside of this case, there's a pad all the way around this back area that helps to elevate the instrument off of the case itself here. And then there's a neck support here with a strap. This part's important too. Okay, and then on the top, you can see that there's a padded area added here, just in case the bridge contacts here. All right. So, and then there's one pad here on the back, and that holds the instrument back down by the chin rest and the tailpiece. So all of these things help the instrument float inside of this case with very minimal components touching the actual body. So the reason that's important is because if this case gets hit, if this case gets dropped or hit, it actually allows the padding and the case to absorb more of the shock than the actual instrument itself. All right, it's really important to get a nice case. So for those who are asking like how much to spend on a case, for fractional instruments, you can find them for less, okay? Usually up to around $200, you know? It's hard to find a really, really high-end case for a really tiny violin, but you can look to spend somewhere between $100 and $200 or $250 even for a case for a fractional violin. If you're playing, you know, to an intermediate or advanced level, and you have a full-size violin, you can definitely look at spending more than $200 for your case. I would suggest spending more than $200 for a case. It doesn't mean that every case that you find over $200 is going to be the best. So you want to look for those components. Look that it has a hard shell, that it has components, padding components in the case that help elevate it and keep it from touching on all surfaces. And that neck strap is really critical. I've seen a lot of musicians, I've repaired a lot of instruments over the years, and a lot of times it's because the violin wasn't strapped in at the neck. So even if you're just putting it back in your case to store for the night, I always recommend getting in the habit of either tying or putting that Velcro strap or buttoning across the neck just to be in the habit of it. Because usually when that happens, it's not that people are really trying to be careless. It's that they don't strap it, they grab their violin to go to a lesson or go to school, and then it jostles around in the case and causes damage. So strap the neck in. This is another case that does the trick. It has the same idea, same components. Padding to elevate it off. A neck strap, stuff in the top to keep the instrument from touching. Okay. I also recommend strapping your shoulder. If you have a case that allows you to strap a shoulder rest down, instead of having it just bouncing around in there, it can prevent damage as well. All right. And then the last thing on cases, I don't want to talk about cases too much anymore, but I want to show you something special for those of you who are going to watch this far into the video. This case is very, very special. I have to put gloves on to handle it. This is a case that actually is one of only a couple in existence in this, especially in this condition. And we happen to have it in the shop. So I'm going to show it to you. It comes out of the actual Stradivari workshop. So that famous Antonio Stradivari violin maker that you hear a lot of instruments are copies of. This is a real one from his shop. And it's in excellent condition. So back then they didn't have factories to like make these cases. They made all these cases by hand. In fact, most times the case was just as much a piece of art as the instrument. They made them very specific, okay? So this is actually a double case. Show you. So you can see the leather. And the brads. Pretty cool, huh? And then I will very, very carefully open it. So this is one of the very few in existence that still has the lining, the original liner. They didn't get the free floating concept down yet. This predates the free floating concept. Okay, so there's clasps here. Even the pockets have like nice fabric lining. Anyway, I thought that would be kind of neat to show you guys.
Is it heavy?
It's like pretty hefty, yeah. It's like solid wood, you know, because even the modern cases have plywood, which is lighter. This is like carved out of wood, wrapped in leather, and then has brads all the way around it.
So what year was that one made?
I mean, 1700s.
How are you supposed to carry it with the handle like right in the middle of the top?
It's latched and everything. You can, I'm not going to do it, but you could. It's pretty sturdy. It looks pretty sturdy on there.
Yeah.
So anyway, you want to get a good case. You want to spend a decent amount on a case. Don't underestimate, you know, how much your case really does for your instrument, especially if you're traveling. It's a simple thing as like taking car trips. A trip in a car could damage your instrument. If you're playing in a hall or like wherever you rehearse, your case can protect your instrument quite a bit from damages. Let's see, what else? Let me look at my notes. Oh yeah, a simple one. Don't, when you store your instrument, even if it's in the case, you want to avoid setting it next to like a heater. You know, they make lots of different types of heaters for homes and studios, like whether you're at a lesson or rehearsal or whatever. So you want to pay attention to like what kind of heating the building has or your home. Some of them look like a vent on the wall and you may not even notice it. You really want to pay attention. Some of them have like a little coil, and you could be, so just pay attention to where you set your instrument down. I've seen lots of damage happen because someone who takes really great care of their instrument, just every single day they were setting it down by a heater and didn't know. And an AC unit as well. So sometimes it's cold air. Just pay attention to where you're setting it down. These are really easy ways to prevent some pretty catastrophic damage to your instrument. The other thing that I didn't talk about is loosening your bow. And some of you have played quite a bit and know this already, but I've seen it by professional and beginner player. So remember to loosen your bow, okay? So when you play, you tighten your bow. This seems like basic stuff. You'll tighten your bow, but you won't tighten your bow. And I've also seen this, you know, from professional and beginner alike. Well, they'll tighten their bow until it's straight, until it's totally straight all the way across or curving the other way. You really, really want to avoid that. Bows can be quite valuable and they can be damaged easily because again, this is just a small piece of wood. It's affected by temperature, it's affected by humidity, and it has an incredible amount of tension pulling across it. So you want to make sure that there's always a little curve here in the stick. And then when you're done playing, you'll loosen this screw. And I get this question all the time, how much to loosen it? You want to loosen it until that screw loses tension. Okay, so the hairs are all the way, this frog is all the way forward. This is totally loose. Okay, so let's see here. Okay, another thing. So in terms of maintenance and preventing damage to your instrument, one component I haven't talked about yet is the varnish. Okay, so we have on our instruments a protective coat called varnish. And it helps to seal the bare wood, and it also has acoustical properties. So this is a really, the varnish covering our instrument is like a paint, sort of like nail polish, and it protects the surface of our instrument as well as gives us a little bit different sound, okay? So most violin makers have their own special formula for their varnish. It's not always the most bulletproof thing, which is funny, right? Because in furniture making, they want to use a varnish that will really protect the wood, and that's all they're really concerned about. They want that wood to like look okay, and they want it to really, really be bulletproof. In violin making, we have this whole other aspect of varnish that is the aesthetic of it. Okay, so how it looks. We want our varnish to like look really, really pretty, which means that sometimes it's not the most bulletproof thing. We also don't want to put it on too thick because it could really dampen the sound and really ruin the sound of our instrument. Okay, so those points, our varnish is very thin. It's just a very superficial layer on the top of an instrument. And we have this other stuff that we use all the time called rosin, which we put on our bow. It's powdery. It's made out of tree sap that's been cooked. You know, so think of tree sap as super sticky, and it might not seem that way when it's in a powder form, but yeah, rosin is very sticky stuff. And when we pull our bow across the string, a lot of that powder will actually come off and get onto our varnish. Okay, and so the question is how to clean it off. How do we clean off our rosin safely? What kind of things can we use? I get this question all the time. People will come into the shop and ask me what polish they can buy to clean off their rosin and keep their instrument clean. So I'm going to tell you, I don't recommend using any type of liquid cleaner or polish on the instrument. And I know that sounds weird, but hear me out. When we clean instruments, so as professional luthiers, when we get an instrument into the shop that needs a really extensive cleaning, we have to be really careful about what solvents we are going to use to help get the gunk off. Because like I said, each violin maker kind of has their own specific formula for varnish. And that means their varnish can be soluble by different things. Okay, so when people come in and ask for a recommendation, if I tell them some liquid polish or varnish cleaner to use, it might dissolve the varnish completely off their instrument if it's not the right type of varnish. Okay, so I always recommend to use a soft cloth, a really soft cloth. So something like a microfiber cloth. You can buy them specifically for cleaning instruments. Sometimes they sell them for cleaning lenses of glasses or cameras. Those are great. And if you wipe your instrument down after every single time you play, you likely won't even need a polish for a very long time until maybe you take it to a luthier at its normal checkup. And then they can do a more extensive cleaning to get the little spots that you might have missed, and then possibly use some solvents. But I'm telling you, as a professional, we'll find an area of the instrument that might not be so obvious, and then we'll test different solvents until we find, you know, one that's safe and can really determine that it's safe, and then we'll clean the instrument with it. Okay, so that's my recommendation for cleaning: is use a really soft cloth. Usually a microfiber cloth is best. Right.
So
let's see here.
how often should an instrument go in for a checkup?
Oh, good. Yeah, that's a great one. So there's different reasons to bring your instrument in. So I guess the bow is one of the biggest things, because these are horsehairs, all right, and they do wear out. They have little tiny barbs on the hairs that will sometimes get worn off and smooth, or the sticky rosin dust will pick up dirt from your fingers, or you'll start to break the hairs on one side because you notice that you might play more on one side. So bow rehairs, when you bring your bow in for a rehair, is a great time to have your instrument looked over. Most shops don't charge you anything to just check your instrument out, so that's a great time to do it. And usually that's around 3 months to 6 months for kind of like someone who plays quite a bit. If you play more or you play really aggressively, or you're traveling a lot and so the humidity and temperatures are changing a lot, you should do it more frequent. I have some clients who come in just as often as they can. They'll come in like every month or every 2 months just to make sure everything is in good shape. Okay, if you're performing often, you may want to come in more. So like every month or 2 months, just to make sure your instrument is in tip-top shape. And like I said, most times that doesn't cost you anything. So if you're playing a fair amount but you're not traveling a bunch and you're not performing all the time, like every week, then you may consider coming in 3 months to a year even. But I would say not longer than 6 months. I think 3 to 6 months is a great time period to get your instrument into a shop and looked at. And one of the biggest reasons, aside from your bow rehair, is for the bridge. So the bridge of your instrument, like I said, very thin piece of wood. It stands nice and straight in the beginning when it first gets set up, but we're constantly changing the string tension when we tune. So you're constantly pulling these strings, they're getting tense and loose over time as your pegs release and temperatures change. Or some people have fine tuners back here as well. So every time you tighten your fine tuners here, it's pulling that string across the bridge and it can change this angle slightly. It's also really hard to see if our bridge is straight. This is not held on by glue at the feet. It's also just perfectly fit to the top and it's held on by tension. So anytime we tip this bridge, it's a chance for that piece of wood, and this is not varnished. This piece of wood is not varnished. Sometimes it's sealed, but really it can change shape. We call it warping, okay? And so it starts out straight, and then over time it can start to warp and warp and warp or droop, and then that can cause it to fall over or snap in half, which is really catastrophic and can cause other damage. So that's a very easy thing for a luthier to check and correct for you. So when you bring it in, you can ask them to check the bridge. They can help get it nice and straight for you again, maybe even put a little bit of graphite in the notches so that your strings can slide smoothly through there again and get you rolling. So yeah, depending on how much you play, 1 month to 6 months.
Okay, so the next question is for like a student instrument. How often would you recommend changing the strings, and how often would you recommend rehairing the bow?
So for a student, I recommend, especially with the bow, the hard thing is as a student, I understand it's just harder to remember to loosen your bow. So what can happen is you can wear your hair out even faster than a professional. Okay, so I recommend the same turnaround, somewhere from usually around 6 months, but somewhere from 6 months to a year. If they're taking really great care of it and they're just working their way through like twinkle variations and like not touching the hairs a bunch, and they're doing a really great job at loosening it, it might not be until a year. But I would just be careful of that, because as you tighten these hairs, what happens is there's only so far that you can tighten this screw and this frog, and I'll show you why that is. If I can open this. Okay, so don't do this at home. But this screw comes out, this frog comes off, and there's a little eyelet right here, which is basically a little nut that the screw sits in, okay? And then there's a slot right here, this mortise, this little slot. That's the only amount of distance this thing can travel in here. So right now you can tell this is pretty tight because this is coming from a very humid area, very moist air to very dry air. So it's kind of tight in there. But as you play, especially if you don't loosen your bow diligently, this will move further and further back each time and get all the way to the back of this mortise. And if you just keep tightening your bow, some people will notice, oh, I keep turning my screw, but it won't get any tighter. My hair won't get any attention. That's because this horsehair is organic, right? It's stretched out so far that it's no longer working. And what I've seen many times is people will tighten it, just keep cranking it, and it cracks the back of their stick right here. It breaks this, or it pulls this screw out of the back, or it strips out this piece, this eyelet here. all of those things either cost money or destroy the value of your bow, and cause a headache. So even for a beginner, I would try to get in at least every 6 months just to have your stuff checked out. Strings, that's another tough one because it depends on what your strings are made of. Some beginners are starting off with a slightly better string that has a synthetic core, and other ones have steel. But also the acidity of our sweat affects strings differently, and our playing styles. So even someone who keeps their nails like really trimmed, they might wear through strings faster just because they sweat as they play, and then they'll eat strings. So you have to look at your strings and listen to them. Even as a beginner, if you pluck a string and you hear the pitch drop, like it goes even slightly, then you probably need to get a string change. If the string is fraying, so a lot of people will try to play through that. They'll feel like a little barb on their finger from a string that's unraveling. Go get it changed. It's better to just have a nice fresh string on there and avoid it breaking on you and causing a traumatic experience for you.
And so I also heard you mention the fingernails. Long fingernails do break strings, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And they can damage your instrument. They can damage your bow. So keeping your fingernails short is important. I know they look pretty when they're long, but it really, really, really helps preserve your strings and your fingerboard. So that's a big one because you may not realize how much you're wearing out your fingerboard, but you'll actually wear grooves down into the ebony. That's obviously not black on this one. This is a special type of wood. We're working with a lot of synthetic or fake like ebonies because we don't want to use ebony so much anymore. It's becoming more scarce. But anyway, your fingers will wear grooves into this part, the fingerboard. If you keep your fingernails nice and short, it does help prevent that. Yeah, and we can reshape this. We can reshape this part. We can even replace this part. But again, it's costing more money and more headache because it can cause things like buzzing and like weird sounds. So yeah.
Anybody else have questions? This has been absolutely amazing. I learned stuff. So.
Yeah. And I mean, I don't know if you wanted to cover anything like what to spend on an instrument. I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, no, go ahead. It would be great
I
to
can briefly
figures.
Yeah, so I'll briefly go over it. So and I can only speak for the shops that I've worked at. I have worked at a handful of shops. And typically what you want to spend, and this sounds vague, but what you want to get the best instrument you can afford. In the beginning, as a beginner, it's less critical to get something that's really expensive. You want to get something that's set up properly. So go to a reputable shop or a reputable maker. And the way to know that is look up reviews, ask teachers in the area, ask other proficient players or musicians like in your local symphony. You can talk to them and say, where do you go? And those are places that you can more often than not trust and get good advice from. So you want to try and get to a reputable shop and ask them, hey, or tell them my child is a beginner. Like I need something that'll get them by, but you want it set up properly, okay? So even if you don't spend a lot of money, if you're spending say $300 to $500 on their first instrument, which is that's pretty low. Please don't buy an instrument off of Amazon. I have nothing against. I mean, that's a whole other story, right? But if you're buying an instrument online, you can't guarantee that when you get it, it will even be the same instrument that they were intending to send you. So what I caution you against is buying a really, really like a $67 to $150 violin off of the internet. Most of the time you're going to have a headache, and it can really discourage someone from playing violin if they get something that doesn't work. They get it doesn't work, and then they think that they're a bad player, and it's just not true. So go to a reputable violin shop or dealer or luthier, even if you're getting a beginner violin. From there, you can usually trade up. And some shops will give you like 70% of that value towards a trade-in. And I know the shop that I work for, Potter Violins, they're the only shop that I know of who gives 100% trade-in if you buy from them. So there's also, so find out where you can get deals like that as well. You know, contact shops, contact makers, ask them what their trade-in policies are. That's good. It's just good homework to do. As you're getting into more of like the intermediate and advanced levels, I really highly recommend to purchase something with as much information as possible. And not only that, play it yourself. So I see this all the time where people will go into a shop and then they won't actually play the violin themselves because they're scared they get a little bit of performance anxiety. This is very normal. However, I really encourage you to play it. You have to know what that violin is sounding like and if it works for you. You know, if it's sounding weird when you play it or it doesn't feel right, it's probably not you. It's try something else. Try as many violins as you can before you settle on the one that you're really going to invest in. And so I recommend making as much of a substantial investment as you can afford. So budget is kind of the limit there, but play as many as you can within that price range and choose the one that really works for you. And the only reason I suggest that is that you can get an old instrument that's like 200 years old. Does that mean that it's better than a new one? Not necessarily. You won't know until you try them. There's such a spectrum of instruments out there. You really got to find something that works for you. And then the only other thing that I'll say is for a bow, that's the other half of your instrument. So a lot of people will invest like a bunch of money in a violin, like whatever, $10,000 to $40,000 in a violin. And then they'll get a bow that is like really subpar that doesn't match their instrument well. So that's the other recommendation I make, is to spend around 30% of what you spent on your violin is a good sort of realm to say you would invest in your bow, so about 30%. And that may sound like a lot to some people, but you'll really be shocked at how much of a difference it makes to have a matching bow.
Okay, and I have one question along with that. Is it, you know, I know sometimes people do get sticker shock with, you know, the prices of instruments when you get to the good ones. Does it make any sense at all to get a really good instrument and then delay getting the good bow by a little bit until you've got more money? I know it won't sound as good.
Oh yeah. I mean, of course, I recommend trying to solve that issue as soon as possible, but sometimes that's part of the process. You know, I wouldn't say just get a really expensive bow because it's expensive. So if you find that violin that's like really does it for you, you know, you've tried several bows on it and it plays fairly well, but it's just not quite right, I would probably hold out until you can find, you know, the best match for that instrument, which may mean it takes you, you know, 6 months or a year or something to find it. So that's a great point.
Wow.
Yeah.
You've been absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. This is a great talk. In fact, I could see telling people they need to watch it throughout the year.
Oh, great.
Thank you so much, Robert. And please do send us information on your new enterprise. It's super exciting. So
Excellent. Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you. And I will send you the link that I put up on the YouTube channel too. Okay.
Excellent. Thanks so much. And if people want to follow along on Instagram, my Instagram handle is @woods.violins. So no matter if I'm in DC or Utah, you can follow along there.
Fantastic. That's great.
All right.
Thanks
so much.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to stop the recording.